Dayton Peace Agreement, and then through the implementation force, I4, and then we go S4, the stabilization force.
Wearing high heels, that was
I just remember the team which came over. Jeremy Greenstock was political director and was our kind of boss, and my boss, and the US team came over, led by Tony Lake, with Dick Holbrook as the kind of number two. Very, very starry team.
Tony Lake's still at the UN. He's running UNICEF.
If you don't mind, give it a whirl. All right, so why don't we get started? Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Center for the National Interest. I'd like to extend a special welcome to all of our Facebook fans watching us from around the world on Facebook Live, something new we've been doing for the last couple of meetings, and it's worked out quite well. We have 1.8 million Facebook followers thanks to the National Interest magazine, which we proudly publish online as well as in print, which I think some of you have in front of you. Good afternoon. My name is Harry Kazianis. I'm Director of Defense Studies here at the Center, as well as Executive Editor of the National Interest. And today it's our pleasure to host, for the first time, Britain's Ambassador to the United States, Sir Kim Darroch. Prior to his appointment here in Washington, Ambassador Darroch led a distinguished career, serving in multiple posts, most recently as Prime Minister Cameron's National Security Advisor. He took the lead on issues such as the rise of ISIS, Russia's actions in Ukraine, the nuclear threat from Iran, and the collapse of government authority in Libya. Prior to that, Ambassador Darroch served in Brussels as the UK Permanent Representative to the European Union from 2007 to 2011. From 2004 to 2007, he served as EU Advisor to the Prime Minister. So now that we all know you so well, Mr. Ambassador, let me just talk a few minutes about how we're going to proceed. Very simple. The Ambassador is going to offer about 5 to 10 minutes worth of remarks. After that, I have a few special questions for you. Then we'll open it to the floor of questions. Mr. Ambassador.
Is mine working? Yes, it is. Thank you very much. And it's a huge pleasure to be here at the Centre for National Interest. And thank you in particular for this lunch. Who knew my first posting was Japan? Really is wonderful.
We planned that strategically.
It's brilliant of you. Thank you. As one or two of you know, I've been here about 15 months, and what can I say about my first 15 months except it's been so quiet, really so little going on. I hope it'll be a bit more lively this year. But more seriously, in the discussion, I'm happy to cover whatever, but I thought I should use these opening few minutes to say something about what is for the UK the story of the moment, which is the triggering of our negotiations to leave the EU, which was, it happened yesterday when a letter from the Prime Minister to President Donald Tusk, President of the European Council, was delivered by a good friend of mine, Tim Barrow, who is our current ambassador to the EU. And technical term for it was triggering Article 50, and Article 50 is the clause in the EU treaties that covers countries leaving. What happens next in process terms is that the EU has to decide on its negotiating mandate for the negotiations that will now happen. And I understand, I mean, it's for the other 27, but I hear they are having a summit, a European summit, on 29th of April to do this. And then there is a bit of work to turn that into a written mandate, then that gets agreed at what's called a General Affairs Council, and then we start negotiations probably around the end of May, but we will see how all of that unfolds. And the Article 50 process, which, as I say, was formally kicked off when the letter was delivered yesterday, about 11:30 Brussels time, the Article 50 process, there's 2 years allowed for it. It won't be straightforward, not least because it has never been done before, and it's complicated, and it's a negotiation. And anyone who follows the media will see that, at least in the media, there are strong emotions on both sides, so there's going to be some kind of background noise around the negotiations. But we, as the British government, are confident that we can achieve an outcome that is good for UK, but also good for the European Union. And the Prime Minister set out 5 objectives in her speech to the House of Commons yesterday, which I'll just go through briefly. She said, point 1, that we would seek a deep and special partnership with the European Union that took in both security and economic cooperation and had at its centre a bold and ambitious free trade agreement. And on that free trade agreement, that proposed free trade agreement, it's just worth my highlighting that it is genuinely, we think, in both sides' interests, and as evidence of that, we took in almost £300 billion worth of imports from the EU in 2015, while sending them about £225 billion worth of exports. So most years, the EU exports more to us than we do to them. So logically, there's interest both ways, but they have at least as much interest in us in a free trade deal. Second point, we will try and strike an early deal with our European partners. We nationally will be ready to do it even earlier, on the rights of our citizens living or working in Europe and EU citizens living or working in the UK. Third, we will look for a fair and comprehensive settlement of the UK's obligations and rights on leaving the EU. And alongside that, we would want to agree the terms of our future partnership with the European Union. Fourth, we will look to agree whatever implementation periods we collectively judge necessary as we move to this new relationship with the European Union, so that there is the minimum disruption for businesses and for individuals with interests in this relationship. And fifth and finally, we intend to make sure that the UK's withdrawal doesn't disrupt the common travel area with Ireland and doesn't jeopardise the peace process in Northern Ireland. So we're ready to engage constructively and sincerely, and we would be ready to start this process as soon as the 27 are ready to go. I want to add that I think we are negotiating from a position of strength. We're the second fastest growing economy in the G7 in 2016. Employment is at a record high, and our budget deficit is down by 2/3 since 2010. Lowest corporate tax rate in the G7, top destination in Europe for investment. And we have strong and established partnerships around the world, especially with the US, partnership worth £200 billion a year, which has created 1 million jobs on either side of the Atlantic. As when my Prime Minister was over here a few weeks ago to see the President, as the President made clear in that press conference, we think we are at the top of the list for a free trade agreement with the US. We can't actually sign that agreement until the day we leave the EU, but we would intend to start preparations for that agreement, private discussions, whatever you want to call it, in the next few months. And the final point I want to make on this is that although we are leaving the European Union, we are not turning our back on Europe or indeed on the world, and we would expect and intend to play a central role in global security. We have the second largest defence budget in NATO after the US. Last year, British forces were deployed on over 300 missions in over 80 countries, but particularly, of course, as you will all know, in Syria, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan. So whether from our shared commitment to NATO to our leading role in the fight against ISIL, we intend to remain America's closest partner on defence, and you will be able to continue to rely on us. So that's a quick overview. Look forward to your thoughts and questions and points of discussion.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Having the moderator's chair briefly here, I just would like to maybe pose a couple quick questions, if you don't mind. Yesterday, I had a chance to sort of parse through the letter that your government sent to the EU, formally declaring or invoking Article 50, and it was quite interesting. And there's one passage I just kind of want to read that leads into my question, and I'm quoting: "The referendum was a vote to restore, as we see it, our national self-determination. We are leaving the European Union, but we're not leaving Europe. And we want to remain committed partners and allies to our friends across the continent, which I think is a very important point. I think you touched on. Now, considering that, do you see, for example, any changes to UK foreign policy goals or interests considering Brexit? Because keeping in mind, of course, all the European Union members try to keep it as tight-knit of a foreign policy as possible. Do you see any divergence there?
I really don't. At least that's certainly the objective. I mean, as the Prime Minister said, and as the letter implies, we do see this as a package. This deep and special relationship involves, we hope, we propose, a security aspect, an economic aspect, and a free trade agreement. And the principle no cherry picking, you don't one without the other. So it is conceived as a package approach. But look, our interests in security and stability and prosperity in Europe are strong. When the Prime Minister saw the President over here on the 27th of January, she made the point, both in the private meeting and in the press conference, that we want the European Union to succeed, to be prosperous and stable and successful. And that, again, is in what she said in the House of Commons yesterday. More broadly, our global interests, the values we try to project and the influence we try to deploy around the world, and our readiness to send our military out where we think that they are needed and can play a role, that's undiminished. In fact, you might argue that the objective is in future that it should increase, and we should be even more present internationally. Add to that our role in NATO as the second biggest contributor to NATO, our place as a permanent member of the Security Council, the Commonwealth, our diplomatic network, sixth biggest economy in the world, a very open market, and strong believers in free trade. We think there's a big role out for us internationally in the future, and we intend to continue to play that.
Okay, well, thank you. I want to turn to your comments a little bit talking about the U.S.-UK free trade agreement. There's a lot of buzz when your Prime Minister was here, and there still is. What I want to touch on a little bit is, in your view, and I know obviously your government can't negotiate until you've formally, concluded Brexit, what potential challenges do you see? Is there any specific bottlenecks, trade groups, industries that could sort of rub against this and sort of challenge it? What is your view there?
Yeah, I'm not a trade negotiator, and I'm glad about that, because I think it's a specialist skill. Those who do it are very good at it, but it's a particular areas of speciality and of diplomacy. I just noticed from what I have seen over the years that when it's come to EU negotiations with third countries, Korea in my time in Brussels, Canada recently, these trade negotiations are never straightforward. And there's always issues come up which have domestic reverberations with sectors of each other's economies. So it would be reasonable to assume that it won't be absolutely straightforward in the stuff of a couple of months when we get down to negotiations on a UK-US free trade agreement. However, in the other direction, they're in a way quite similar economies, and so that should make things a bit easier. There are huge mutual interests, we think, with the amount of trade that goes on already, and with the amount of mutual inward investment. As I say, 1 million Americans go to work in British companies over here, and 1 million Brits are working in American companies over in the UK. So there's a really strong foundation to build on. So, if we can't do a good deal, mutually beneficial deal between the UK and the US, you'd worry about our chances of doing lots more deals around the world, but I'm confident we can do it. It won't be straightforward. I mean, just one example, I don't know whether it'll be a problem or an issue in these negotiations, but in all my time in watching from the ambassadors sort of committee, Coreper, the progress of other trade deals, EU trade deals, agriculture was always an issue. So, maybe it will it'll need a bit of talking about between us and London and Washington, but we'll get there, I'm confident.
All right, sounds good to me. So I am going to stop abusing the moderator's privilege, and I'm going to open the floor to questions. Very straightforward. We have mics in the back. People will come to you. All I ask is you please identify yourself, name and affiliation, and keep in mind we are going till 1:30, and that is a hard stop, as the ambassador is a very busy man. So with that, let's start it up. Ma'am, please. Mike will come to you in a sec. I believe we have mics. If you could. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Marisa Lino with Northrop Grumman. As much as has been written about the announcement yesterday in the letter, probably an equal amount has been written about the Scottish vote. And I wanted to ask you to, as I understand it, Westminster must approve a second referendum. So I wanted to ask you if you could explain a little bit exactly how this will proceed, and whatever else you want to comment on with respect to this second referendum.
Yeah. On the technical process, you need to pass legislation in Westminster to approve a referendum in Scotland. That's what happened with the referendum a couple of years ago. On the principle, the Prime Minister said yesterday, and this is very clearly the government's position, that this is not the time for a second referendum in Scotland. And without going too much into speculation, if you think about it, at a moment we're about to launch the negotiations with the European Union on our exit. There's a big question mark over part of the proposition, and until you know what the answer to that question mark is, it would really make no sense to have a second referendum. So I see no prospect, and the government are clear that there is no intention of agreeing to a second referendum in Scotland at this stage while we launch and enter into these negotiations.
All right, thank you. I had Jeff Kemp in the back next.
From Geoffrey Kemp here at the centre. Could we move from Scotland to Ireland? And could you say a little bit about the border issue between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and whether this is a unique issue that will be on the Irish-British agenda, or is this something that will have to be discussed with the EU?
Yeah, I mean, we will see how we handle it in exact terms, but the intention is certainly to involve the political leadership in Northern Ireland, and I can't be too specific here because at the moment you have a political issue in Northern Ireland, which means that essentially the civil service is running the administration in Northern Ireland, while the Secretary of State of Northern Ireland negotiates with the parties about trying to get a new executive in. So we're in a slightly an unusual situation at the moment, which we hope to resolve soon, when the political issues separating the parties can be sorted. But the intention certainly is to involve the Northern Irish leadership in the negotiations. The Prime Minister is committed to that in principle, and the details, I think, still to be worked out of how that would happen. On the issue of the border, as I said, one of the principles the Prime Minister enunciated was that we wanted to avoid disruption of the common travel area between Northern Ireland and Ireland, and we wanted to avoid any threat to or risk to the peace process in Northern Ireland. Now, that doesn't mean involving the EU in the peace process. What it does involve is trying to negotiate this comprehensive free trade agreement between the UK and the EU, because if you get that, that obviously makes it a great deal easier to preserve the common travel area pretty much as it is. So there's some complications here, and there's some detail that needs to be worked out. But if we get the package that we have set as our proposal, then I think that we can be confident about achieving those objectives in relation to the common travel area and to the peace process.
All right. Next, we had Ambassador Bloomfield right to my left here.
Thank you. Well, Sir Kim, thank you. Nice to see you. Lincoln Bloomfield, Stimson Center. This is a little bit more of an open-ended question and an invitation for you to comment on the potential for U.S.-UK cooperation. I'm looking at this sort of chaos in Washington with respect to intelligence matters. So many things are coming out that would normally not come out. There are hearings happening as we speak on the Senate side. The British intelligence has been dragged into the story. No one is quite sure where this is headed or what to believe. There's dissension between the executive branch, the White House, and the intelligence community. And yet in Britain there's a legacy going back to the Iraq War, which left quite an imprint with respect to the reputation of the intelligence that was used in 2003. You had the report on Prime Minister Blair, the fact that the British Parliament voted down the Syria intervention when President Obama was poised to do something, and that turned back the U.S. Ambition to go into Syria at a time when, if I read the tea leaves correctly, the EU letter, there seems to be an attitude on the EU side that we'd better give the British a bad deal to sort of encourager les autres. Don't let anyone else think this is a good deal. We're going to drive a hard bargain with the Brits. And so you wonder whether, at a time when both countries are going through so much turmoil, there's actually a life raft that each can throw the other. Because now that Britain is sort of out of the EU structure militarily, the U.S. is ramping up defense spending. It's involved in Yemen. It's stepping up Syria, Iraq. Afghanistan is a question mark. We'll either do things together or we won't. Is there some way that the British can help Washington stabilize its thinking on intelligence, on Russia, and sort of calm down and focus? And at the same time, is there something the U.S. can do to calm down the Brits with respect to the sense of isolation and where they're going in terms of their own defense, to regain, if you will, our reputation to work as a partner at a time when the Americans are stepping on the throttle a little bit?
Ambassador, it's a very interesting, as you say, quite a wide question, and I'm probably not going to answer it very adequately, but I'd say the following things. Number one, we are spending on defence. I mean, we're at 2.1% of GDP at the moment on defence in the UK, and we're coming to that moment when there's a big regeneration of capability, and we're building the two largest aircraft carriers we have ever built. I think the Navy will have the biggest ships they've ever had, plus quite a lot of other ships. We're about to buy 138 F-35s. We're buying a lot of Apache helicopters. We are buying 9 P-8 maritime patrol aircraft and a whole lot of other kit beside that. I think we're spending $240 billion over the next 10 years, and quite a lot of it is being spent on American equipment, which will both increase interoperability and interaction. And I guess, we're glad to contribute to employment in the military industrial sector here in America. And by the way, the F-35s, 15% of them, kind of back end, are British aerospace. So that's a joint project. So there is already quite a lot going on with the replacement and upgrading of our capability that involves the US. Alongside that, we have a number of things that we are doing to actually, any one time, we have about 900 British military embedded in all three branches of the US Armed Services, but we're taking that a step further. So, for example, we're just doing an agreement now under which US F-35s will be able to land on the decks of our aircraft carriers and vice versa. So that will take naval-to-naval cooperation a step further. So there's a lot of that going on, and the direction is all towards much deeper cooperation and involvement and shared facilities and all that. And I haven't even mentioned the next generation of nuclear submarines that we're about to start building. At an intelligence level, the picture is similar, and I can't go into detail on that, but the relationship between the agencies, NSA, GCHQ, MI5 and the FBI, and CIA and MI6, has never been closer. And again, there are practical steps happening that are deepening that level of integration, level of sharing even more. So the picture is extremely strong in that area. So all of that is happening, hoping, which I hope ensures that the alliance we have that is already so strong can only get stronger over the next decade or so, not just in terms of the politics of it, but in terms of actual practical interaction. The other thing I would say is that the messages we're getting from the new administration are extremely positive in terms of consultation about policy. And that, of course, as you know, from your own background, is crucial to us. The joke is that we provide about 10% of the equipment, of which we would like 49% of the policy. And our National Security Advisor was in Washington beginning of this week. Foreign Secretary was here last week. He saw Vice President Pence, saw Tillerson, Secretary of State Tillerson, saw National Security Advisor McMaster. Mark Grant saw HR McMaster on Monday. And the structures and processes we are setting up to consult on all of the big issues on the international scene are a step beyond what we have done over the last decade. So I also find those extremely encouraging. So that's a long-winded way of saying you're absolutely right about our ambitions, and there is, I think, the foundations there to take those ambitions forward and to deliver on them.
I had you, Ruth, next.
Oh, thank you. Just a slightly different topic, but I wonder, I take it the Channel Islands. I take it that the Channel Islands are nominally independent, although in case of emergency, Britain would come to their rescue. But I wonder what is the current state of play in encouraging greater financial transparency in British affairs.
Dimitri wants you to introduce
Oh, excuse me. And I'm Ruth Wedgwood, untransparently. But it is quite irksome to have the Channel Islands be used as this kind of Monte Carlo bank that nobody can penetrate.
Ruth, I tried to anticipate all the questions I'd get when I came here. I absolutely failed to anticipate that one. So I will have to wing it and say that there is a process underway, not just with the Channel Islands, but also with other dependent territories. We have, say, in the Caribbean, to deliver all of our international commitments in terms of transparency and all of that stuff. And it's not something you can do overnight, but it is certainly our intention to ensure that all parts of the United Kingdom and all of our dependent territories absolutely live up to our international commitments. And if we're not there yet, the intention is to get there as quickly as we can.
Because you don't want the Panama Papers to become the Channel Island Papers.
So next I had Bridge Colby to my left here, if we can get him a mic.
Hi, Bridge Colby, CNAS. Thanks, Mr. Ambassador. I wanted to ask you about the UK's perception of China. I think there's been some concern over the last few years that at least in some quarters in the UK there was a bit of a deaf ear, or even further, about China's increasingly assertive behavior and increased influence and potential leverage in Europe. And just, for instance, seeing, just to take an example, how vocal the French Minister of Defense has been at the Shangri-La conference in the past over some of the South China Sea issues in comparison to the UK. I was wondering if you could comment on the current government's perspective on China's growing influence and increased assertiveness, and how how you're looking at that, and how you'd look in particular at the security issues and the potential growing sort of geoeconomic leverage that China appears to be seeking to assemble.
Yeah. There's two parts to this answer. First part, China is a hugely important economic and commercial partner for the UK. China is a big investor in the UK, including recently in our next generation nuclear power program. And is also hugely important to us as a destination for our exports. And successive British governments have tried to build up relationships with China on that basis, and in recent years it has been successful. Hence all the talk of a golden era between the UK and China, and political relationship falls in the same category. Second part of the question is, we have the same concerns as you find in this town and more widely. We have concerns about some of the trade practices you see in China. We have concerns about activities in the Southeast China Sea. We have concerns about North Korea, where we would like to see China take a greater responsibility for resolving the threat that the North Korean nuclear program represents to many of us. The answer is to pursue these issues through dialogue, and that's what we're doing. We will watch the visit of President Xi here with great interest, because, as I say, our concerns, I think, are widely felt and are the same here. And by the way, when we talk to Chinese leaders, it's not like we ignore those concerns. We raise our concerns and try to make progress on them. We also often remind the Chinese our interest of what happens in Hong Kong. So there's quite a lot going on in that relationship, and we are, I promise you, robust when we think there are issues to be concerned about and what we say to the Chinese.
Thank you. I have the young lady right here to my left, right up front. We can get her a mic. Thanks.
Hi, Kelly Torrance, Deputy Managing Editor of the Weekly Standard. So as Britain goes through negotiations to get some of its sovereignty back, a lot of, I consider very smart people think that there is a real risk that by the end of the process, the United Kingdom itself, Great Britain, might be breaking up itself. And I'm wondering if that is something that will be in the minds of the government officials during the process, and if they will keep that in mind, if there's anything they might do differently or keep in mind to try to hold the UK together.
As the Prime Minister said in the House of Commons, I mean, we are all strong and committed supporters of the United Kingdom, of the Union. So it is fundamental as we go into these negotiations that we are not intending to do anything that would prompt or encourage the breakup of the Union. Does it affect how we would negotiate? I mean, trying to put myself in the shoes of the negotiators, having done all this work in the past, I don't think so. I think the Prime Minister set out 5 very clear objectives, which I set out in my opening remarks, and those seem to me to be consistent with a good outcome for the whole of the UK. So if we can achieve and deliver those, I am confident that we'll be fine.
I had a gentleman right in the back there, right in the center. Please, yes, sir.
Tony Coruscant with the CSIS. I wonder if you could comment on what your impression of this departure of Britain from the EU is going to do towards the EU's approach to defense and national security. You had discussions, or at least mentions already in the EU, of a return to an EU approach to security, even talking about the nuclear dimension, but at the same time, you're looking at an EU which has not followed Britain's example. You have steady, ongoing, and very sharp cuts to readiness and capability in Germany. You have a very disorganized front structure, if you'll excuse the phrase, to defense. A very mixed pattern in most of Europe as to whether countries, even if they're at 2%, are maintaining their current force levels and readiness. And just what impact do you think that Britain's departure from the EU is going to have on this.
Yeah, on the EU, in particular in relation to European defence, we do say that NATO is the bedrock of our security and the priority here, and the EU is not an alternative structure, and anything the EU does in this field should complement NATO, not kind of duplicate it. So we've been very careful throughout our time in the EU to oppose anything that we think would duplicate NATO structures or actions or would complicate NATO's role. There have been some new EU operations, for example, one off the coast of Somalia about protecting shipping that we have participated, indeed led, where NATO hasn't wished to act and where the EU has been able to play a useful role. But let's be clear, any EU role in this area should be complementary, not duplication. On NATO, the criticism that only 5 NATO member states out of 28 members are spending 2% of their GDP on defence is a fair one. And I think the US supplies something like 70% of NATO capability. And that's not fair on the US, as successive US administrations have pressed NATO partners to contribute more, and they're right to do so, have been right to do so, and they're right to continue to do so. And we ourselves say, at a moment when we're spending 2.1% of GDP on defence, we say to our European allies that we think they should do more. So that's a continuing objective which we share with the incoming US administration. Third point, you rightly allude to not just how much money you spend, but how you spend it. And the key commitment here is the 20% of your defence expenditure needing to be on equipment. And countries also needing to upgrade their capability consistently so that they're using the most modern equipment, most modern weapons in terms of the effectiveness that provides. We also do that. We spent 20% or more than 20% on capability. In fact, we're spending $240 billion over the next 10 years, an illustration of that. And it is as important as spending the 2% that you spend as close as possible, more than 20% on equipment. So that's another point on which it is right to press our NATO allies to do better. Secretary of State Tillerson is in Brussels, I think on Friday, for a NATO foreign ministers meeting, where he has already told the press he's going to press on this point. Secretary of State, Defence Secretary Mattis is in London this week and will be coordinating, no doubt, messages with our Defence Secretary Michael Fowler. And then we expect the President over in Europe doing a NATO summit at some point in the late spring, where this is undoubtedly going to be a centerpiece of the discussions. And as I say, all of this pressure from Washington is, we would judge, appropriate.
Thank you. I had a gentleman right here in the center with glasses, right there, right? Yes, right there. If he still has a question. No?
No, I didn't.
You're all set? Okay. The young lady right next to you then. Yes, please.
I'm taking notes of what the previous one.
Mr. Ambassador, Ann Guerin with the Washington Post. Could you expand a little bit, please, on something you said a few answers ago about your government's dealings with the new administration and how you're finding the flow of information? There's been a lot written about nobody home at the State Department and difficulty getting people confirmed at the higher and mid levels. Are you finding any problem getting your own questions answered, getting in to see the people you need to see? And then just a moment ago you mentioned Tillerson at NATO. How do you assess he was going to go, then he wasn't going to go, then he was going to go again to the rescheduled meeting? Were you surprised by that? What would your advice be?
On your first question, the frank and straightforward short answer is no, we're not experiencing problems. Indeed, the contrary. The Prime Minister was lucky enough to get into, she was invited to see the new president within a week of inauguration, 27th of January, which was actually historically early for a British Prime Minister to get it. I mean, we checked the records back. So we couldn't have had a warmer or more gracious welcome or got in sooner, we felt. Foreign Secretary was over, as I say, last week, and in one day, a day also when I think there was something going on healthcare. You know, I mean, I don't follow these things obviously, but it was obviously quite a busy day for the administration. Nevertheless, he got to see, basically in the course of a day, Vice President Pence, Secretary of State Tillerson, and National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, which I think is pretty good of an administration to be that accessible on such an exceptionally sort of pressured day in the domestic, kind of legislative calendar. National Security Advisor over on Monday, again, had several hours discussions with HR and his team. Chancellor has already seen Steve Mnuchin. We are having absolutely no problem, I promise you, with access or with accessibility or with availability. So from where we sit, the British Embassy, it has been exceptionally easy and open and accessible dealing with the new administration. On Rex Tillerson's on-off, look, he had a problem, as I understand it, over a clash of dates. The original date for the NATO summit was the NATO Foreign Ministers meeting clashed with the Xi visit to Washington. The media have attached quite some importance to Secretary of State Tillerson being present at all these White House meetings, so I don't blame him for thinking he should be present at such an important meeting. Alternative dates for the NATO media have been floating around for a while, and they settled on the 31st, which is, I think, this Friday. So we got there, and it's great that he's coming over to Europe pretty much just for this meeting, racking up the air miles already, and so it's all fine.
Thank you. So I had a gentleman to my... Yes, sir, please. Thank you. Mike's coming to you.
Vince Morelli with the Congressional Research Service. It's all well and good for both sides to put a positive spin and face on the upcoming negotiations, but I mean, for Brussels, this is less about the future of the UK and more about the future of Europe. And so it seems like the negotiators are already under a great deal of pressure to make sure that Britain doesn't get a good deal in their mind, because there are a lot of others that are going to be watching the outcome of some of these discussions and looking down the road, and there's a great deal of pressure in some countries in Europe right now by the Eurosceptics to say, let's take a look at what's going to happen with the UK's negotiations and see if there's something we can get down the road. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, since you were there in Brussels, I mean, how do you see the Europeans putting their act together and coming at the UK on this, and what countries do you guys see are going to be the problem folks? I mean, if Macron wins in France on a pro-Europe program, are they going to be a difficult partner? The Germans are committed to keeping Europe going, so are they going to be a good partner? And then, if that's the case, what does the relationship between Germany, France, and the UK shape up to be as we go through this process?
Mm. Yeah, that's quite several aspects to that question. Just on whether we're going to get too good a deal as we leave. I mean, what we're talking about here is a pragmatic outcome to the negotiations, which is good for both sides. And if you were to have a breakdown in negotiations, and us leaving without a deal on, for example, free trade, I mean, tariff barriers don't help either side. And as I hope I explained, in a way, the other 27, the EU is a bigger exporter to the UK than we are in the other direction. So there ought to be at least as much interest in Brussels as there is in London in doing a good, comprehensive free trade deal that preserves as much as possible of existing open borders and free trading arrangements. Second point here, Prime Minister said in her press conference, in her speech to the House of Commons, that we accept that one of the consequences of leaving is that we will not be part of the single market. What that means is we will not be a voice at the table when decisions are taken about the rules and regulations and systems in that single market. So we will have to accept what they decide amongst the remaining members about those issues. And some people would say that that's quite an important thing to give up. Now, it's no different from our other free trade arrangements. So if you have a free trade deal in the future with the US, then whatever rules and regulations and whatever you have here, we will have to accept. So we're ready to do that. But it's not like, we're walking away and we're going to get exactly the same as we get when we're in. It just won't be like that. There will be some things that we will no longer be part of and no longer be able to put our views forward on the shape of decisions that are taken. Third point, look, I shouldn't really myself be commenting on the future of the EU, but I just observe that, having spent a lot of time in my career working on this, that there is, at the moment, there is quite apparently a big debate going on between those who think that the answer to the challenges facing the EU, and there's no question but that there are challenges facing all of us in Europe, is essentially one of more powers for national governments. And there is another side of the argument which is about deeper integration being the answer. And that, EU needs to resolve collective consensus answers to these challenges to move forward, because at the moment there's a lot of debate, and you would sense that it's the time to make some decisions about future direction. But that will be for them, and our objective is to negotiate a good outcome on our departure arrangements, and then, while having this, we hope, deep and special relationship with the EU, to create some strengthened new relationships around the world.
Thank you. Please, sir, go ahead. Mike's coming to you. Just give me 1 second. Thank you.
John Negroponte. Ambassador, could you talk a little bit about, Russia's very much in the news here in this country, and I don't want you to comment on today's, the ongoing hearings and all of that, but how's Russia perceived in policy circles in the UK?
Boris Johnson's Foreign Secretary is about to go there, which will be the first time we've had a Foreign Secretary in Moscow for a while. We have Ambassador, maybe 3 levels of concern about Russian policy at the moment. We would like to find a common policy with them on Syria, and we don't think you can get a political solution in Syria while President Assad stays in power. So we would like to find an agreement with them that provides a path to Assad's exit, and that's one area of dispute with them at the moment. Second, on Ukraine, we don't think you can change a country's borders by force, and so there's an issue over Russia annexation of Crimea, and there is an issue over Russian encouragement for the separatists in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, and European sanctions on Russia stemmed from those policy actions by President Putin, and we would like to see that resolved through the Minsk process. But at the moment, it's not moving forward. And then third, we are concerned about what we perceive as Russian actions more broadly in Eastern and Central Europe. And you can point to what's going on in Montenegro, you can point to potential risks and activity elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe, and that is potentially destabilizing and disruptive, and we would like to see it stop. What are we doing? We've moved 800 ground forces, 800 troops to Estonia as part of strengthening NATO's eastern border. We're participating in the Baltic air patrols. We are, the way I've described, increasing our own defense capability. We think all of NATO should do that so that we are in place to send the appropriate signals to Russia. All that said, we think it's important that there is dialogue, and that's why Secretary of State Johnson's going there next week, and why we would support Secretary of State Tillerson, who's going there, I think, just after Boris Johnson. And it's important you have these channels open, as you know from your own distinguished career as a diplomat. But you use the channels to put across some tough messages about the unacceptability of areas of Russian policy at the moment, and hope that we can persuade them to change those policies.
Jacob Halburn. Mike's got
Halburn from the National Interest. Jacob Halburn from the National Interest. Ambassador, I was wondering, when do you think Donald Trump might visit England?
Good question.
Well, he's very welcome whenever he would like to come. But he is in Europe at least twice, we expect, this summer, or late spring summer, because there is the G7 summit in Italy, I think it's Sicily, in late May, early June, late May, I think. And then there is the G20 summit in Germany, in Hamburg, I think in July. And if it would suit him to drop into London around either of those visits, he would be extremely welcome.
Thank you. So we're running great on time. Any question? Paul Saunders, please.
I'll give you one. I hate to ask the same question for a third time, but I'll ask it in a slightly different way with a little bit of a political science bent. So I take your point about negotiating with the EU and the EU's commercial interests in the trading relationship with the UK. But at the same time, their large amount of exports to Britain is divided up among a number of players, while your roughly equivalent volume is all in one place in your country. So the cost to any individual European government of taking a hard line is not quite the same as the cost to the EU as a whole. Do you think that's a challenge for you in this process?
I couldn't argue with the sort of simple mathematics of what you say. Nevertheless, if we were to get into a position where there wasn't an agreed outcome, and you were into going back to WTO rules or into tariffs or whatever, it isn't good for anyone, even those who export a little less to the UK by proportion than some others do. Plus, there is a lot, I mean, it's not just about trade and a constructive future relationship between the UK and Europe and the EU can have many aspects, including security and intelligence and economic links and scientific cooperation, which we would like to continue, and all these sort of things. So if you add up all the potential pluses and then look at the counterweight of the advantages of having a really bad deal or no deal at all, in any pragmatic, sensible, rational world, it just doesn't add up. So you just have to hope that and expect, it's not just about hope, and expect that common sense is going to prevail. And of course you're going to get, as I said in my remarks, you're going to get a certain amount of political noise and debate and points being made around all this. And if you've watched, as I have, the debate in the UK as closely as I have over the last year, still quite a lot of that stuff going on, but the time has come to move on and do a deal that is mutually beneficial, I would say.
I had a question right here, and then next, Danny Davis after that.
Thank you. Mary Ellen Cannell from CNA. Mr. Ambassador, could you comment on whether the UK might have enhanced interest in the Commonwealth and what opportunities that might represent for the UK in terms of trade and global influence?
There is certainly, I perceive, in the British government at the moment, and particularly in the Foreign Secretary's mind, a strong interest in strengthened relations with our Commonwealth partners, and a belief that we have rather underused that relationship in the past. So, in principle, you put your finger on something that is absolutely an ambition of the government. It's a bit trickier to tell you what that will mean in specifics, because the focus has been on thinking about the nature of our future relationship with the EU, and people haven't worked through what a strengthened relationship with the Commonwealth might mean in practical steps. So that's something for the future, but it's certainly part of the government's ambitions. Given what a diverse grouping of countries it is, you're not going to do a kind of free trade deal with the Commonwealth as a whole, although there are certainly major economies that we would we would put high on the priority list for individual free trade deals in future. But with the Commonwealth as a whole, let's see where we go, but it's certainly something people are thinking about in London.
Next, I had Danny Davis right here in the center.
Mr. Ambassador, Danny Davis from Defense Priorities. You mentioned a minute ago about Russia and Ukraine and Crimea and all those issues down there. I wonder if you could tell us from a perspective of the British Foreign Office, how do you handle the, I guess, negotiations or discussions with Russia that bring up to mind all the things that we, as NATO are all pretty much unified against, and their aggression and all this sort of thing, but then also take into consideration Russia's perspective on things, and and to say, all right, well, you have some valid concerns here, et cetera, because there's certainly a number of folks, probably on both sides of the pond here, who seem to act as though Russia doesn't have any valid security interest. Everything that they do is certainly wrong, and so we want to push that back. But certainly, it seems from a diplomatic perspective, if the other side doesn't see any benefit in negotiation or discussions, that they're not going to be likely to do what we want them to do. So I wonder if you could talk about how you handle that very delicate situation.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I'll give you one particular example, and then talk more generally. A particular example in the case of Russia, which I've drawn because of my EU background, is the Russian government, because I heard this when I was National Security Advisor direct from my Russian counterpart, were unhappy and upset in that they didn't believe we had ever properly listened to Russian concerns about the impact on them of an EU-Ukraine free trade deal and the porous nature of the Ukraine border with Russia, and therefore what EU goods, as it were, flooding Ukraine would mean for Russia. And a number of, I'm talking about 2-3 years back, they made these points to a number of European countries, and on the back of it, we got the Commission to start talking formally to the Russian government about whether there were things that could be done that would alleviate those concerns or mitigate those concerns. Now, I don't think it's got anywhere very much, to be frank, because I just think that they got kind of blocked, and then the free trade deal also is at the moment blocked. But as an example of trying to listen to Russian concerns, then it has some relevance here. More generally, with Ukraine, there were also big concerns about Ukraine's ambitions to be a NATO member. on which there's actually quite a long way to go before that is ever going to happen, given all the criteria for NATO membership. Ukraine has quite a way to go to meet them. So in our own dialogue with the Russians, we have been making that point as well, while saying no country, no third country can have a veto on any country's aspirations to be in NATO. So this is a rather sort of, these are examples which I think point to an answer that it's important to have a dialogue with the Russians about what really concerns them and what the real motives are behind some of the things they do. And we recognize that and we try to do it. And when Boris Johnson gets to Moscow next week, these issues will be high on the agenda, and he will want to listen to what really lies behind Russian concerns. But we've moved away from a world where you have kind of spheres of influence and where you can kind of say that country can't join NATO if it wants to, or that country can't join the EU when it wants to. So there's a limit to how far you can go, I think, with this, but it's important to listen to the concerns and the motives and see if there's anything you can do to meet them.
Next I have Dimitri.
Thank you. I have an easy question, Mr. Ambassador. Do you think that as a result of NATO expansion, Britain is more or less secure? I remember vividly about 25 years ago, before the center was created, but Richard Nixon already had a small group of people around him who were getting together at the Carnegie Endowment. It was a very interesting debate between a senior official in the new Clinton administration and George Kennan. And a senior official from the Clinton administration was talking about NATO expansion as something that could be done deliberately, in a very calibrated manner, and without any real damage to relations with Russia and Russian reform. And George Kennan said, you don't understand Russia and you don't understand America. Once we open the door for NATO expansion, we will not be able to keep it calibrated. And once the Russians see NATO moving closer and closer to their border, that will have a profound impact on their conduct. In the spirit of full disclosure, Nixon decided to support the NATO expansion, at least the initial wave.
Did Dr. Kissinger support it?
Most definitely. And again, the spirit of full disclosure, I also supported it. But the question is, looking back, where we were and where we are now, did NATO expansion, as conducted, make us more or less secure? And I will ask you specifically if you look from the British perspective.
Yeah. When you said this is going to be an easy question, I knew instantly that was the opposite of the case. Look, I have to say, first of all, from British government's point of view, it is a good thing and represents the adoption and expansion of the liberal values that are important to us if countries want to join NATO. So I have to say that it's good for NATO and good for our security and something we have to welcome. The other point I'd make, though, is it's important that you have criteria which you stick to on when countries are ready for NATO membership, and you don't kind of bend the rules for political reasons, so that countries coming into NATO do both fully represent the values we all share and are able to play a sufficient part in collective security. So we need to be disciplined about ensuring that NATO membership isn't too easily, as it were, given away or offered around. But in principle, it surely has to be a good thing if countries want to join this, and it must be better for our security if NATO incorporates more countries in the European mainland.
Thank you. So we're going to go around, so please take you, and then we're going to go right around. So our friend from the Weekly Standard, if we can get her mic.
I noticed when you were talking about China and in what gets mentioned in trade negotiations, and you mentioned, trade barriers, issues in the South China Sea, Hong Kong, North Korea. But one thing that struck me that you didn't mention was human rights. And, Canada's new ambassador to China, John McCallum, just said that human rights and labor standards will be a definite part of the discussion and part of any deal Canada does with China, which surprised a lot of Canadians, including myself, since it has not been a very high priority until now. And I was just curious, was that just you left that out just unthinkingly, or was that a specific non-inclusion there?
It was yet another example of unthinkingness. Look, it's a fair point. And I mean, actually, I know this because as National Security Advisor, I used to oversee this. One of the aspects of our current UK relationship with China is that we have, at quite a senior level, a particular consistent dialogue on human rights issues. And although that may sound to you, well, it's another dialogue, getting the Chinese to accept that and to agree to participate is, I promise you, is something. And then to stick to that commitment so that the dialogue happens at regular intervals, and it gives us a forum in which we can raise whatever human rights concerns we have at the moment, including quite often events or developments in Hong Kong. So it was an omission rather than a piece of deliberate policy, and certainly human rights is part of the dialogue.
Thank you. So we have the gentleman in the back next.
Hi, Michael Crowley with Politico. Your predecessor spent a lot of time on the Iran nuclear deal. After talking a lot about it during the campaign, we don't hear much about it from Donald Trump. I wonder if you were able to say anything about what you're hearing in your conversations with the administration about their thinking on the deal, and short of that, can you at least give us your prognosis for how things play out over the next year or so?
Look, what we understand and what we hear is that they are thinking about it and debating it internally. I think it's very unwise in the light of events of the last 12 months to make a prognosis about anything anywhere. So I hesitate to do that. But just for the avoidance of doubt, we are very clear in all levels of our very productive and constructive dialogue with this administration that we support the Iran deal, that we think it has been instrumental in setting back the Iranian nuclear program, and that it should be preserved, while simultaneously taking the Iranians to task over their activities in the Middle East, whether in Syria or with Hezbollah in Lebanon, or with the Houthis in Yemen, or in Iraq, or whatever. But we want to see this deal preserved. It needs to be policed properly, implemented rigorously, but we think it's something that we need to keep.
Next
Could I two fingers?
Sure, please, sir.
Can you really keep them to task without putting the nuclear agreement at risk from the point of view of Iran? Because, I mean, I feel that the agreement was basically to get a 10-year suspension of their nuclear program in exchange for giving them a pass on what they do in the region.
Yeah, John, I mean, we will see. But one of the things that we were supposed to be able to do, and to an extent have started doing, in the improved atmospherics that followed the doing of this deal, was a much more active dialogue with them, at least speaking for the UK, on all the regional issues. And I mean, we started as UK from a very low base. We didn't have an ambassador in Tehran, and we had to clear out most of the embassy after it was attacked in 2010. And we've now put an ambassador back, and we have restored the embassy, and we've had ministers going to Tehran, which we hadn't had for several years. So we're talking to them. And that at least gives you an opportunity to raise our concerns about their policies elsewhere in the region. Now, we will see whether that's effective or not, and we will see whether we influence their behavior. But I'm not sure that prior to doing the nuclear deal, the international community as a whole was proving massively effective in changing Iranian actions elsewhere in the region. So I think it's right that we should give dialogue a chance.
Next I had Jacob.
I would like to follow on my colleague Paul Saunders' incisive question, which is what a lot of people are wondering is, given that the negotiating field is in fact stacked against the UK, why did you trigger Article 50 now under no duress? Because it has a 2-year deadline, so the Europeans can simply try and press their thumb to the British windpipe, knowing that this deadline is 2 years and that Britain has more to lose than the EU.
It's a picturesque metaphor.
He's good at those.
If you look at it from the other end of the telescope, the British people voted to leave on the 23rd of June, and we're now almost pretty much 9 months on from that. So if I look at the debate back in my country, there has been quite a lot of people saying, what's taking you so long? How come you've needed 9 months to get from that decision by the British people to starting the negotiations? So you can play this both ways. On your point about windpipes, yeah, I mean, you can present the negotiation in that light as a kind of, fight to the death where the opponent is twice our size and twice as brutal, or you can say it's about, given the democratic decision the British people clearly taken, now finding the most mutually beneficial arrangements. And as an eternal optimist and a believer in the human spirit, I just think we should go for a constructive outcome to the negotiations rather than something that was bad for both sides.
We had 2 questions here. That the gentleman's closest to me, and then right after. Mike's coming to you, if we could. Thank you.
I was going to ask about Iran, but there have been 2 questions on Iran since I raised my hand, so I'll pass.
Right behind you, then.
I'm Mark Seibel with McClatchy Newspapers, though I think we're not supposed to say newspapers anymore.
That's okay.
In Washington, we're really in sort of an extraordinary time here. We have a counterintelligence investigation by the FBI into some of the president's closest associates. We've had a national security advisor fired who turns out to have been a paid foreign agent while he was advising the president-elect. And we have an investigation, 2 investigations, maybe 4, in Congress now, one of which is moving in the direction of trying to determine what impact fake news and Twitter bots and that sort of thing had on the election that could call into question the legitimacy of the result. And I'm curious, how closely are you following those developments? Where do you rank them in your priority list of things to worry about? What are you telling London are the risks of this sort of uncontrolled slow boil scandal? And are there special markers that you're watching for to know whether to raise the alert level?
Yeah. We follow everything that goes on, not just in Washington, but we like to think across the country in some detail because that's our job. And we also report on everything that is going on because, again, it's part of our job to give the most objective and accurate analysis of developments in this country, both in terms of domestic policy and domestic events as well as foreign policy. So yes, we follow it very closely. And yes, not just in America, but in Europe and across the world, we are living in extraordinary times. So there's no debate about that.
All right, so
but in terms of In terms of how we are interacting, our objective is to have the best possible and closest possible relationship with the administration, with all US administrations. We feel we made a very good start with this one. There's a lot of business we want to conduct with them. We want to help to shape future policy on a lot of issues of mutual concern, and we are not being distracted from that primary objective for us as an embassy and for the government by everything else that is happening, which is not to say we're not interested in watching everything else that is happening. But in terms of interaction with the administration, it's about taking forward common interests and common objectives, trying to exert influence, present our opinions where the opportunity is there, trying to take forward what we want to see in the world.
Thank you. So we've got two left. Graham, I'm going to have you, and then Ruth.
So thank you very much. On the same question, so Graham Allison, sorry, a friend of Dimitri's, and apologies for my plane. But in your reporting back to London, so let's just imagine, I'm just being hypothetical. So one person says to you, Mr. Ambassador, tell me, with respect to Russia and the fixation about Russia, have the Americans lost their mind? Okay, that'd be theory one or theory two. No, this is quite normal and natural. And if it were analogously occurring in Britain, you'd have an analogous phenomena. Or if it had happened, indeed, maybe the Russians did Brexit. Why not?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more of a commentary than a question, and there's not much I can say to what I have just said. Yes, we follow and watch everything, and the media coverage is exhaustive and sometimes exhausting, but it's also, intense, and as in any democracy, the media has an important role to play and needs to be respected. But we also have an important job to do in getting as close and constructive, influential relationship as possible with the new administration, and that's a big part of what we're about here.
And for the final question, Ruth, please.
It's going to be a little recondite, so forgive me. But so I am a huge fan of Alexander I, who was the guy who actually abolished slavery in the U.S. by threatening to blockade, to break the French and British blockade in the Pacific and the Atlantic, and also lives long enough to have the Martens Clause be part of his heritage. But I guess I wonder, wandering around London where I can't even afford a cup of coffee anymore, it's about 12 quid. Somebody has a lot of money in London. and I wonder if there is concern that Mother Russia, whose antecedent roots I greatly respect and cherish, nonetheless is having so much political influence, money talks, Channel Islands walk, in London, that there is a concern that really just a dollar for dollar, ruble for ruble, we were outgunned in making sure that disquisitions on what the attitude toward Moscow should be is purely neutral.
Well, I suppose to London you'll have your own views on what the average Londoner thinks about things. I mean, it's my city as well. I mean, there is no doubt there are a lot more Russians in London than there were 20 years ago, and that a number of them are very wealthy individuals. One of them owns my football club, the football club I support, namely Chelsea, and he's put a great deal of money into it, and we've won a lot since he came in. So he's brought great benefits to all Chelsea fans. He's a great man. Look, what do I say here? Is there concern? Look, I think there is concern in British Parliament and in British public and British media about aspects of the current Russian government's policies. But it's not like the Cold War. I don't think you'd find a lot of British people would say it's a new Cold War. I think you would find some who would use that language, but it's not It's not the kind of consensus view, but people do worry about some of the things that Russia has done. And London, as you know, is a massively cosmopolitan place with communities from almost every country, and there's a Ukrainian community that have views on what's going on, and there are a lot of people from Central Europe living there who have particular views on Russia's history. So there is that there, but I would just say it doesn't feel to me like the Cold War, and you don't find people when Boris Johnson goes off to talk to Moscow, or when the Prime Minister I worked for, David Cameron, who saw Putin maybe 8 times in my time working for him. People don't object to that. They think it's a good thing that we're talking to this government and this leader, even though they disagree with aspects of his policy. So, it feels to me, I would just say, better than back in the 80s and 90s when I started my diplomatic career.
And I think with that, we'll have to leave it there. If everybody could thank the ambassador for joining us today. Thank you.